It's Game Boy World, and this is Volleyfire. I tried to avoid hyperbole here on Game Boy World. Sure, I have opinions about what's good and bad, and I try to add a personal touch to this chronological survey of Game Boy's history, but other nerds are much better at being angry about video games than I am. So, rather than rant and scream about how terrible Toei's Volleyfire is, I will instead say, thank you, Toei. Thank you for never licensing this game for American release. The children of the USA appreciate your remarkable kindness. Toei, of course, refers to Toei Animation, whose work we've already seen once with last year's Fist of the North Star 10 Big Brawls for the King of the Universe. That game proved to be far less impressive than its expansive subtitle, which is pretty much par for the course with Toei. At least for their games, anyway. Toei has produced some truly classic anime through the decades, from Galaxy Express 3.9 to Sailor Moon, but for whatever reason, that acute talent for great cartooning did not translate into a similar aptitude for video games. So we have Volleyfire, a game that, to the best of my knowledge, represents a bid by Toei to create a new and original property in gaming rather than something derived from a license. It's a nice plan, would that it have paid off. We've seen lots of Game Boy releases so far that were based on games from the early 80s, and they've enjoyed varying levels of success via their monochrome adaptations. For example, Heian-kyo Alien presented a faithful version of the original computer game alongside a remixed remake, offering the best of both worlds. Lock and Chase added more robust and varied stage designs and play mechanics. Even Master Karateka, which wasn't really all that much fun to play, allowed for some customization by introducing a skill point allocation system. As for Volleyfire, well, like I said, it's an original property, so technically it's not based on an older release, but it arguably feels older and more dated than any other Game Boy title to date. Combining essentially Space Invaders with Pong, Volleyfire is a head-to-head competitive shooter in which players can either blast one another or tackle a story mode. Either way, it's the same experience. You control a space fighter that can only move back and forth along the bottom of the screen, trading shots with an enemy fighter that squares off against you along the top edge. It's a simple premise, and it feels like something you would have seen on Atari 2600 or in television back in the very early 80s. Though for the life of me, I can't find a game that plays quite like this on either system. So I suppose Volleyfire is really wholly original. The 2600 or in television comparison isn't really meant as a compliment though. What worked in 1981 didn't necessarily fly in 1990, which is why we haven't seen a Game Boy port of Donkey Kong yet. And that was the rock upon which Nintendo built its console business church. Volleyfire is painfully simple in design. Yes, simple is best on Game Boy, given its limitations and deficiencies, but there is such a thing as too simple, and Volleyfire crosses that line. The entire game consists of head-to-head battles against a single enemy ship at a time, with the arenas growing more cluttered with each level. There's a good idea at work here, but Toei's development team didn't go to the lengths necessary to make that idea work. Both you and your opponent have a health bar that you whittle away by blasting at one another. This is made more difficult by the field of debris between you and your enemy, which blocks and obscures shots. You can also nullify an enemy's fire by hitting their beams with your own. Some stages incorporate mirror-like barriers that can reflect laser fire back at the source, posing a threat to both you and your rival. As you advance through the game, the levels become more complex. Some of them incorporate forward scrolling, though this is automated, you can still only move side to side here as you try to avoid being sandwiched by the scrolling scenery. Eventually, the arenas begin to fill up with other hazards, some of which are passive, while others exist to impede you, but not your opponent. For example, you'll occasionally have to deal with infinitely spawning enemies that appear in the middle of the screen and add their laser fire to your main opponents. In other areas, the screen will fill with mines that constantly regenerate after you shoot and detonate them. There are also lumps of space junk that can be pushed with gunfire. By shooting those into your opponent's lane, you can restrict their ability to move around, though they can also do the same to you. After facing off against 3 ships in sequence, you have to battle a boss. These tend to have multiple parts and incredibly high resistance to laser fire, so it takes quite a while to whittle them down. The bosses, much like everything in Volleyfire, aren't terribly difficult. They are, however, numbingly tedious and generally quite boring. Volleyfire has a pretty decent idea behind it, but it lacks the spark of inspiration that would elevate it from a rote mechanical exercise to a fun, challenging one. The shooting is boring, enemies are slow and stupid, and the play mechanics limited. Even more frustrating, the collision detection is terrible, perhaps as a result of the generally shoddy animation. You'll frequently hit your foes with shots that seem to fly wide, which is nice, but the same often happens to you. The game looks terrible and behaves poorly. It's easily the most amateurish thing we've seen on Game Boy. I get that the system was pretty limited and required some effort to yield good results, but good grief. You can collect a few power-ups along the way, most helpfully a laser upgrade, but you lose this if you continue, which inevitably you'll have to do since you don't recharge your health between stages. Dropping from the boosted laser to the default really drives home how crappy the shooting action in this game actually is. I'd say this is the sort of game that can be fun against another player, but the problems with Volleyfire run much deeper than brain-dead artificial intelligence. Sharing this kind of sadness with a friend doesn't make for less sadness, it just makes for two sad people. Volleyfire suffers a sort of fundamental dreariness that no amount of company nor competition could ever help improve. And yet, it's not the worst game we've seen on Game Boy, nor will it be the worst we'll see throughout the rest of 1990. Volleyfire may not be fun or interesting or well made, but it does at least have a germ of invention at its heart. Had it arrived about 8 years sooner, and had it been programmed to be faster and less janky, it's the kind of game that would be fondly regarded as an Atari-era classic. Dropping with a dull thud on Game Boy, only in Japan, with bottom-tier quality in every respect, however, well, it takes more than a neat idea to make a good video game, and Volleyfire, I'm afraid, is not a good video game. For more obscure duds, keep watching Game Boy World. Next time, we get to see what a truly terrible Game Boy game looks like.